Law&Crime. I'm Terri Austin, and I'll be with you for the next 2 hours of our latest trial news. We continue in Atlanta for the high-profile racketeering case against Grammy winner Young Thug, also known as Jeffrey Williams, and his co-defendants. Now, the state suggests that Young Thug leads the criminal street gang Young Slime Life, or YSL for short. The defense, however, says that YSL is just the name of the record label, Young Stoner Life. The state also suggests that the co-defendants are responsible for murder, attempted murder, armed robbery, witness intimidation, and drug dealing. The trial is already the longest in Georgia's history, and it is nowhere near finished. Nearly 75 witnesses have testified so far, and prosecutors foresee calling over 100 additional witnesses as the case continues. The trial will likely last through the first quarter of 2025. Defense attorney Doug Weinstein, who represents Deamonte Kendrick, filed a motion asking Judge Paige Whitaker to put a time clock on the state. He wrote, quote, that the state will develop the speed and efficiency of our finest Olympic athletes and that the finish line of their snail-like marathon is in sight. The state lives their lives, they go to work, and they get their paychecks no matter how long this trial proceeds. Meanwhile, for Kendrick and the other defendants, every day is Groundhog Day. But instead of waking up to Sonny and Cher, he wakes up to the cacophony of Rice Street and the ritual of heading to court. Weinstein further wrote that the court should, quote, limit the introduction of duplicative or unnecessary witnesses by the state. And lastly, he said, quote, Kendrick and the other defendants sit in their jail, their lives on hold, the clock ticking on their lives, second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, month by month. I want to talk about this with my guest, trial attorney Bob Hella and law enforcement instructor Sonny Slaughter. Bob, I have you here in the studio. I'm going to ask you first, is this right? These witnesses are sitting in jail for so long, and the fact that each of the co-defendants is behind bars for all of these months, is it fair from a constitutional perspective that they have to wait for the state to continue their case?
Well, the Constitution provides for a speedy trial. It doesn't have to say when the trial starts that it has to be speedy, because the public also has an interest in the state presenting these proofs, which is why we have it the state versus, not just an individual versus, like in civil law. So the people have a stake in this and making sure that justice is served both ways. Number one, fairness to the defendant, but also in terms of having the state be able to prove its case against the defendant.
Exactly. And, you know, Sonny, the thing I'm thinking about is these defendants sit behind bars, just like we saw in the motion, day by day, month by month. And I do believe that they are being treated unfairly when they have to wait for the state to make all of these arguments. And in fact, they've had to sit through a change of judge. Do you think that there's any possibility that this case could be dismissed?
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to see both you and Bob. I'm not sure whether the case will be dismissed. However, when we think and talk about criminal justice reforms and practices, from the standpoint of holding defendants in place, incarceration, and having to endure those conditions in incarceration really takes a toll and goes against the presumption of innocence as opposed to guilt, because keeping someone detained really shows and to the public that they are guilty, as opposed to what we always say, the presumption of innocence does not appear. And with all that has happened with this particular case already being the longest case that Georgia has ever had, and I am aware of how RICO cases play out, this really does taint when we taint the criminal justice system processes. That's what I'll say.
You know what? I couldn't agree with you more. I think when the public is looking at this case and they are considering how long it's taken, you sort of lose faith in the system, Bob. Don't you agree with that? That when it takes so long for justice to occur, I mean, it took so long to even get a jury, and now the trial has been delayed repeatedly. I mean, the public is losing faith, yes?
Well, I think Sonny makes an excellent point on that because now, one, we're focused on the trial. We also have to balance it with the rights of the defendant. And the constitutions in most states and the federal government require that offenses have bail and bail availability. And the reason for that is that somebody doesn't have to sit in jail while justice is being served. And that's the case here. And at some point, somebody's got to start relooking at why these people are incarcerated. Now, the state, as well as the federal government on that end, has a right if somebody's a flight risk, if they're a danger to society. This is a gang trial, even though it's couched in terms of RICO. So those are factors that the court needs to look at with each individual defendant and then make a decision on whether or not, hey, look, guys, you're taking so long here. We're not going to keep this person in jail. We're going to put him out.
That's a really good point. Sonny, one of the things that has happened in this case is Young Thug's attorney has repeatedly asked for a bail, and he still sits behind bars. He has multiple counts against him, but murder is not one of them. And the fact that he may or may not be a flight risk, I think it's a great argument considering the length of time, at least for him and for the others who don't have those types of serious charges against them, to allow them to be outside of jail while they await this trial to continue.
I agree with both of you. From the lens of the public and what they think about criminal justice processes, and most people are not informed about the constitutionality of things, but they have a perception of when they see justice versus injustice and what happens to people of color who are marginalized, even though they may have a history of what criminality looks like. There is still a judgment of our systems and what juries are impacted by. Now, remember, even though we have these individuals here and they are being detained, a jury, a public jury, is also being detained and under just as much scrutiny based on the information that they're having to ingest and divulge, and just try to figure out. But from a public perception, this does not bode well for when we think about what our criminal justice system looks like. Now, if they're a flight risk and then they have electronic monitoring, they have other ways in which other cases and other defendants have been released, have been monitored and surveilled. So why not this now? As Bob stated, this is a gang trial, right? So there are specific elements that need to be addressed, but individually and not collectively. And we need to rethink what we are doing when we look at this particular case and how we are doing it.
That is such a good point. You raised about the jury sitting, not just the public waiting, not just the defendants, the witnesses, and more importantly, that jury. We may lose some of them after such a long length of time. I also wanted to address Fulton County Republican nominee Courtney Kramer. She's expecting to challenge Fani Willis's dismiss of the case immediately if elected. So let's take a look now and talk about that if in fact we can. Bob, do you think Fani Willis will dismiss the case if in fact she is asked because of everything that's going on?
Well, first of all, this case, the legal term for it is a mess, okay? It's just become so complex, it's unwieldy, it's becoming disjointed for a number of reasons. It's a real, I think, challenge for the jurors to focus on the evidence and try and make some sort of sense of that evidence in terms of what they're going to be asked to do at the end of the case. Having said that, for a prosecutor to come in and say, I'm just going to pull the plug, this case has already impaneled the jury. There have already been charges filed. It is now the judge's case and the jury's case. It's not the prosecutor's case anymore. So, with respect to that, they're going to have a good reason to come in and do that. But again, yes, I think that there are some advantages to the defendants in this case because the longer this goes, the more disorganized it becomes, the more difficult it's going to be for the state to get a conviction here, frankly. But Again, that's another issue.
I agree. And Sonny, one thing I was thinking, Fani Willis has had her issues in the past. If in fact this case is taken all the way to her, do you think having the issues that she has had in terms of her decisions while she is overall the prosecutor in Atlanta here, will that affect her decision on this case, you think?
The intersection of prosecution versus politics and policing is always a very interesting conversation. And Prosecutor Willis has had a number of successes, but with this particular case, I don't think that the success continues to move on when it comes to a prosecutorial lens. Dismissing the case, I'm not sure whether that is going to happen, but I do think, as Bob said, we are losing the momentum and faith in the criminal justice system. So whether it's politics or the prosecution stepping aside, I think what's going to play out more is how people feel about our criminal justice system, and particularly those in the Fulton County area. What are they thinking about all of the things that have amassed in 2024 that has come out of the prosecution office? Do they have faith, not just in this case, but in other cases? And will that become a challenge, even if Fani Willis stays in place or if someone else comes into play?
Such excellent points, no question about it. Fulton County has had its share of problems, and the public is probably thinking twice about how well that prosecutorial office is now functioning. All right.